the trusts that I'm aware of and that I've worked with that have adopted what's quite bluntly called a zero tolerance approach to discipline and behaviour have seen dramatic increases in exclusion rates, both fixed term and permanent. Here's one that always gets the juices flowing, I think. I'm responding at the minute to a friend of mine on Facebook who's having a real old rant about the current state of exclusions, fixed term and permanent.
Okay.
And just wondered what your guys' thoughts were on it in terms of why the increase, what's caused it. Is it academisation?
Is that what's happened? Has it gone up? Has it increased?
It's gone up dramatically. Yeah, it's gone up dramatically, and I've got to say mainly in the secondary sector. So, what do you think?
I've no formal knowledge on this at all, but would I be right in thinking, I might suspect that particular trusts have got higher rates of permanent exclusion than others?
Certainly, yeah. I'd say that the trusts that I'm aware of and that I've worked with that have adopted what's quite bluntly called a zero tolerance approach to discipline and behaviour have seen dramatic increases in exclusion rates, both fixed term and permanent.
Problem though with them publishing those figures is that you have a set of trusts in a certain area, and you have a trust in another area. It's completely contrast in terms of the general attitude towards education of families in the area. You're going to have a much higher exclusion rate, I'd imagine, at one where.
Of course, yeah. But Ofsted take that into account, of course, environment.
Going back then to whether it's whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I think is the question. Not whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Whether exclusions, the increase, why that's happened.
Yeah, I think that's
why has it happened?
Why has it happened?
You know,
what's driven it?
And I think you're right. I think basically people are taking that zero tolerance towards behaviour more seriously over the last few years, and therefore they are arriving at further exclusions. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or not is an entirely different question, I suppose. But I would have thought that would be the reasoning behind it.
Yeah, and because they can a little bit, the whole point is that they've got more control over that kind of thing. The local authority isn't a check where you've got more freedom now to.
Is that the case? Is it a lot easier to exclude nowadays?
Yeah, a trust sets its own has its autonomy.
There's protections in place, but ultimately, they're all arguing the cases, I'm sure they are, that this is the better result for learners everywhere, both the excluded and the rest of the class. We all know, sat in a classroom, that one child can have a huge impact and ruin the lesson, can't it?
I think as well there's a big important thing here of looking at, first of all, how beneficial they are to the student. Let's just ignore permanent exclusions for a second and look at the fixed term ones. Do they improve the students' outcomes? Is a good question. Is it a shock of being excluded? Does that make them come back in and go, right, now I'm going to get on my work? I'm going to, does it have any? Does it work basically? And then the second thing is, does it benefit the other students? Because that's actually quite important, I think. Because if you've got a class of basically 30 students, you've got one that is a problem in every single lesson. So we're not just talking about them being a problem in one particular lesson. We're talking about them broadly. They're causing issues. Then taking them out of that environment, does it have a massive benefit for those 29 that are in there? You know what I mean? Is that going to completely transform their learning? Because in that sense, fixed term exclusion is actually quite beneficial to 29 other students. So it's definitely a controversial thing, but it's like, how do you judge whether it's good or bad?
I don't know whether there's been any research into that. I've not read it. I tell you what I'm seeing a lot more of.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's perhaps an attempt to deal with, it's quite altruistic in my opinion, but also an attempt to deal with reducing the number of fixed term and permanent exclusions. A lot more schools now have another building.
Yeah, isolation.
Call it what you will, isolation unit, alternative provision, on-site alternative provision, a lot of schools are calling it. That seems a lot more prevalent than it was.
I think it massively depends on what happens there though. And that's where there's been a big thing of the quality of an isolation unit or alternative learning, whatever you want to call it. It really depends on how much of a good quality the coffee machine's going on. I think that's it. So it really depends on what benefit, how that's run. It depends on how it benefits the child. Is it a reintegration program? So you're trying to get them, understanding the value of their education. A lot of it's about these students trying to get them to understand the value of the education, which is obviously very difficult in certain areas.
Is that achievable by sitting them in a black cubicle for hours upon end? I don't know. You can answer this question, I think, in two different ways. Certainly, I can. I can answer it from my Every Child Matters.
Yeah, that's it.
Or I can answer it from a parent's point of view as well. And I think there's, sadly for me, there's two different answers. Because as a parent, I want to know that yes, my son or daughter is going and being able to access every piece of learning they deserve without the teacher being pulled away and distracted and by challenging pupils and situations. But then I've got a nagging sort of thing at the back of my head that I feel, and certainly I've heard stories that where schools are almost flaunting the opportunity to get rid and to my question is, why are they doing it? Is it for this zero tolerance approach where parents would say, yeah, that's really good because now or is there something more hidden? Is there a hidden agenda where their performance, their league table standing would look better by removing these learners? Steve, you might know something about that.
Basically, if you remove, particularly if you exclude within year 11 or year 10, they're definitely still on your figures. Because there are schools that will do that, and obviously it is massively detrimental to their figures. Like in the general case, the people you're excluding, obviously, in many cases, isn't going to have a particularly positive effect on your figures anyway. So you're saying taking a hit, but you might be sitting there thinking, well, I'm not really taking the hit because they're probably not going to get particularly good GCSEs. Obviously, if it was a case of someone got caught using drugs and they were permanently excluded because of a very serious offence, but they were a very high-flying student, then obviously that will have a particularly negative effect. But as a general rule, if it's just this student has never paid attention in our school, causes problems, and now we've got the chance to exclude him, it might not actually be that big of a negative effect.
It would be really interesting, therefore, to find out if there are figures on this. Is there a greater prevalence of permanent exclusions in year 7, 8, 9 than there is in 10 and 11? Yeah. Certainly, when I think back to my last role in school, finding alternative placements, provision for students, that was a big part of it. And a vast majority of cases, it was a year 10 or a year 11 pupil. And just to throw something else in here, I know it's a slight aside, UTCs, I think, come into the equation here. A lot of the UTCs that I've worked with in the last year or two, not the leadership, because perhaps, but just talking to tutors and teachers, there is a feeling in some UTCs that they are becoming a bit of a dumping ground for students that would otherwise be provided for within school or alternative provision. So there are other UTCs I've worked with that have exactly the kind of intake they want, very skilled students with a vocational mindset. But there are others that are really
That's
suffering.
That's why it's difficult, isn't it? It's working out whether the child that's causing a problem, is that because the way they're being taught is causing them to be distracted and cause a problem. Whereas if you took them to a UTC, they're actually, by being active learners, for example, or they're interested in the vocation, that's going to solve those problems. But you get that wrong and you end up with a dumping ground, and you get that right, and of course it gives them a whole new issues.
See, what's interesting as well is the union take on all of this. I was reading, I can't remember which union it was, but I think it was in Teaching Today recently, and they were talking about the unions apportion the blame here on cuts. No surprise. But and what they're saying is that they believe that a lot, the increase in fixed term and permanent exclusions is largely down to cuts in finance, and that they articulated that in two different ways. So firstly, that schools don't have access through to children's services, to other external agencies, because they're not there anymore.
No.
They're not there anymore because local authorities have been slashed and stopped.
The team around the child team is shrinking all the time.
Now, the other alternative is to have that provision within school, and they say the schools simply don't have the budget to have somebody a specialist or a team of specialists within a school or within a trust that look after that cohort, if you like, which I thought was an interesting take.
Yeah, I think that is probably a massive part of it, that the school basically can't provide the support that's necessary to basically do that reintegration process. So they might have permanently excluded someone, they might have fixed term excluded someone before and then gone through a series of reintegration steps that would hopefully stop the same behaviour occurring or reduce it. Whereas now maybe it's, fixed term exclusion, straight back into lesson. Oh, well, it's happened again. Fixed term exclusion, straight back into, and that then, suddenly you've got 2 for where you would have had 1, or 3 for where you would have had 1, and then suddenly that's going to be a huge increase, isn't it?
The landscape has changed, hasn't it? And we've got to look at whether the academies having this way in which they can exclude, whether that's been detrimental in their reasoning. And the government have commissioned a review of how exclusions are being done. So that will be really interesting, and that's really what we're trying to work out, whether there's been a change because of the structuring of schools.
It will be interesting then to see the results of that, I think.
When's that due out, right?
Don't know. Shortly, they've just commissioned it. The problem is that the schools aren't even necessarily giving the data. So they've got to do something to make them get the data and understand what's actually happening, and whether that is just simply, whether there's anything other than the health of schools going on.
The IDSR does report the exclusions, and it does compare. I think it compares your exclusions, and it takes local authorities' exclusions and a national exclusions. But like I've said, each of those broader figures don't take into account anything about who's in your school.
Even
now,
within an LA.
You could work out, you could sit down and look at the IDSR and go, okay, yeah, really high pupil premium count, really high EAL count, and work out whether it was particularly good. But obviously an officer inspector only has the small amount of time beforehand to look at the IDSR. So if there's a big, percentage exclusion, and they've just been in another school where it's a tiny one, are they immediately just going to make that decision? And so we have to be, I think I think everyone in education does have to be a bit careful about those sorts of figures, because they are a bit dangerous, because they just have a kind of one-trap meaning that maybe isn't relevant.
Well, what do you think to this idea where a trust that's grown out of a certain area, a certain demographic, where it might be slightly leafy, it might be,
and then begins to take on schools.
And then begins to take on schools and imprint through quite a sort of strong regime their discipline, their ethos generally, their whole sort of teaching and learning sort of thoughts, and because of that, because they may be working in a more deprived sort of high pupil premium area, that simply doesn't work. And when I say it doesn't work, it might be working, but it results in a higher exclusion rate because they're trying to use the
until
same
it appears that it's working.
Until it appears that it's working. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it just depends, because the thing is that you do get a lot of trusts that end up moving into often it's actually just become massive, and the leadership can't cope with it and can't make the changes it needs, and then they end up collapsing. I guess a lot of it depends on whether they're looking at the performance of the schools, looking at other factors like what does the parental. I think that's quite an interesting one. Like what's the parental feedback on this, all the schools in this trust? How does it respond? Because that a lot of that is what matters. How sort of positive the feedback is from the pupils, the parents, the teachers. Do you know what I mean? It's quite a difficult thing to quantify, isn't it?
But we can see in data results, a combination of exclusions and performance of the school, and we all know, and there's a mix. There are multi-academy trusts that are doing a brilliant job and turning around schools with that system, where they've taken a leafy system into a more deprived area and it works. It doesn't seem to maybe at first, and there's huge change, but that works. And there are others that do that badly and fail. Ultimately, they've got schools within their multi-academy trust that don't improve.
But they don't understand.
Maybe because they don't understand that the leadership isn't just not effective. Ultimately these multi-academy trusts they vary hugely, and they can be brilliant and they can not work. And as long as you identify that.
There has definitely become this new thing of turning around schools. Turning around schools is now like a big phrase, isn't it? And you speak to people and they come in and they say, this is what we do. We go in, we find pupils that are causing the big problem, we permanently exclude them, and that's almost like a badge. That's like what they do. And often they do find the scores go up through the roof, because suddenly all the other pupils can be taught by each. It's a very quick fix. It's a quick fix
Yeah.
for, and so they go minus 0.5 to minus 0.2 to plus 0.1.
So what you're talking about is attainment and progress H,
Yeah, I am,
which is an interesting
Yeah.
angle as well. So we're not talking about 5 A's to C's anymore.
No, and they rip up their curriculum, so they'll rip it up and they'll go, right, we're just going to do 7 subjects because that's all we need to. They'll get rid of certain teaching staff. They'll do all of that stuff, but I don't know whether it leads to a healthier environment. That's a big question, like, because what happens is the positive effect it may have on some students more important than the fact that it may not being, I don't want to be too dramatic, but it's going to ruin the lives of 10 or 15 potentially by permanently excluding them.
So it is a dilemma. It's a dilemma for the heads of multi-academy trusts.
Yeah.
The reason why we have these conversations is to hopefully spark further conversations, certainly amongst ourselves, but and we're always looking for feedback and thoughts from everybody who's watching this. But I think on this one, I would love to hear a bit of student voice on this. I'd love to know what students take on the rise, or if they've seen a rise in exclusions, and what impact they think it's had socially and academically within their school. That'd be a really fascinating bit of feedback, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Brilliant. No, cool.
That's a good point.